The scissors felt cold against my neck as my grandmother's trembling hands cut away the last of my long auburn hair. Each snip echoed through the cramped bathroom like a gunshot, and with every fallen strand, I watched 17 years of my life disappear down the drain. Outside, the sound of engines grew closer, and we both knew we were running out of time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma, you have to understand, Grandma Rose whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant rumble of motorcycles. This is the only way you'll make it out of Millbrook alive. 3 months earlier, I thought my biggest worry was passing my senior year chemistry exam and deciding which college to attend in the fall. I lived with my grandmother in a small house on Maple Street, right in the heart of Millbrook, Oregon, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the most exciting thing that happened was the annual Corn Festival every September. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 12, leaving me in the care of Grandma Rose, who worked double shifts at the local diner to keep us afloat. She was a tough woman, weathered by years of hard work and loss, but she had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. Those same eyes that used to light up when she'd braid my hair before school were now filled with terror as she held those scissors. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I was sitting in that bathroom, disguised as a boy named Ethan with a fake ID burning a hole in my pocket, I need to tell you about Marcus Kellerman and his family stranglehold on our town. Kellermans had owned most of Millbrook for 3 generations. They controlled the grain elevator, the only grocery store, half the rental properties, and through various shell companies, pretty much every business that mattered. Marcus was the heir apparent 25 years old, built like a linebacker, and absolutely convinced that everything in town belonged to him, including me. It started innocently enough. I'd been working part-time at Henderson's hardware store since I turned 16, saving money for college. Marcus would come in occasionally, always finding excuses to talk to me, always lingering just a little too long. At first, I thought he was just being friendly. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone chatted with everyone, where small talk was practically a social obligation. But then the visits became more frequent. He'd show up right before closing time, when I was alone in the store. He'd lean against the counter, blocking my path to the register, and ask about my plans after graduation. When I mentioned wanting to study journalism at Portland State, his expression would darken. "Portland's a dangerous place for a pretty girl like you," he'd say, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "You'd be much safer staying here in Millbrook. I could take care of you." I'd laugh it off, make some excuse about needing to count the register, and he'd eventually leave. But the conversations grew more uncomfortable each time. He started talking about how we'd be perfect together, how he'd been watching me grow up and waiting for the right time. The way he said "watching" made my skin crawl. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in February. I was restocking shelves when Marcus walked in, but something was different about him. His usual cocky swagger was replaced by something more predatory, more urgent. He didn't bother with small talk this time. "Emma, I've been thinking," he said, walking straight toward me. "You're 18 now. You're old enough to make your own decisions about your future." "I have made my decision," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the fear creeping up my spine. "I'm going to college in Portland." His face hardened. "No, you're not." The certainty in his voice chilled me. This wasn't a suggestion or even a strong opinion. This was a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who was used to getting his way. "Marcus, I think you should leave," I said, moving toward the phone behind the counter. "Mr. Henderson will be back any minute." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Old man Henderson owes my family more money than this store will ever make. One word from me, and he'll fire you tomorrow. One word from me, and your grandmother loses her job at the diner. One word from me, and you'll both be out on the street." The threat hung in the air between us like smoke. I knew he wasn't bluffing. The Kellermans had destroyed other families for much less. The Johnsons had owned the local bakery until they refused to sell to Marcus's father. Within 6 months, their suppliers had mysteriously doubled their prices. The health inspector had found violations that had never existed before, and they'd been forced to close. They'd moved to California, leaving behind 50 years of family. "History, what do you want?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "I want you to stop this foolish talk about college. I want you to start thinking seriously about settling down with someone who can provide for you. Someone with roots in this community. Someone like you, exactly like me." He stepped closer. Close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of a predator marking its territory. "Emma, you're going to be mine whether you like it or not. The question is whether this happens. The easy way or the hard way." I was trapped behind the counter with nowhere to go. Marcus reached out and touched my cheek with his finger, and I jerked away like I'd been burned. "Don't touch me," I snapped, surprised by my own boldness. His eyes flashed with anger. "You need to learn some respect, little girl. In this town, the Kellerman name means something. My great-grandfather built half of these buildings with his bare hands. My grandfather brought the railroad through here. My father modernized the farming operations that keep this whole place afloat, and someday, all of that will be mine. And you think that gives you the right to claim me like I'm property?" The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. One moment, I was standing defiantly behind the counter, and the next I was on the floor, my cheek burning and my ears ringing. Marcus stood over me, his face twisted with rage. "You need to watch your mouth," he said quietly. "I've been patient with you. Emma, I've been gentle, but my patience has limits." I touched my cheek and felt the wetness of blood where his ring had caught my skin. In that moment, looking up at him from the floor of Henderson's hardware store, I realized that Marcus Kellerman wasn't just entitled or pushy, he was dangerous. "If you tell anyone about this," he continued, his voice so calm it was terrifying, "I'll make sure your grandmother has an accident at work." Those deep fryers at the diner can be so dangerous, especially for someone her age. It would be a real shame if she slipped and fell. He left me there on the floor, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully as he walked out into the rain. I sat there for 10 minutes, too shocked and scared to move, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally made it home, I told Grandma Rose I'd fallen and hit my cheek on the counter. She fussed over me with ice packs and worried questions, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. Over the next few weeks, Marcus made good on his promise to make my life difficult. Mr. Henderson, who had always been kind to me, suddenly became distant and critical. My hours were cut in half, then cut in half again. When I asked why, he couldn't meet my eyes. "Business has been slow, Emma," he mumbled. "Might be time for you to start looking for something else." But there was nothing else. Every business I approached had suddenly decided they weren't hiring. The manager at the grocery store, who had practically begged me to apply just a month earlier, now claimed they had no openings for the foreseeable future. Even the movie theater, which was always desperate for help, had mysteriously filled all their positions. Grandma Rose's situation at the diner grew precarious too. Her boss, a nervous man named Pete Sullivan, started writing her up for minor infractions, arriving 2 minutes late, using too much ketchup on a customer's burger, failing to wipe down tables that were already spotless. Each write-up brought her closer to termination, and we both knew it. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be everywhere. He'd drive slowly past our house in his black pickup truck, sometimes stopping to wave at me through the window. He'd show up at the grocery store when I was shopping with Grandma Rose, always managing to bump into us in the cereal aisle or by the milk coolers. He'd sit in the diner during Rose's shifts, ordering coffee after coffee and watching her work with a smile that never touched his eyes. "Emma," he said to me one afternoon when I encountered him at the post office, "have you given any more thought to what we discussed?" "I've given it all the thought it deserves," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. His smile widened. "That's unfortunate, because I've been talking to some friends of mine about your college plans. Did you know that Portland State has had some trouble with campus safety lately? Lots of young women are going missing. Lots of accidents. It would be terrible if something happened to you so far from home." The threat was clear, even wrapped in his fake concern. He wasn't just trying to control my immediate future. He was telling me that even if I managed to escape Millbrook, he'd find ways to hurt me. That night, I finally broke down and told Grandma Rose everything. I sat at our tiny kitchen table, the same one where she'd helped me with homework for 6 years, and I told her about the slap, the threats, the systematic destruction of our lives. I told her about Marcus's promises to follow me to Portland, about his plans to make me his wife whether I wanted it or not. Rose listened without saying a word, her face growing paler with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded on the table. "I should have known," she finally said. "I should have seen the signs." His father was the same way, took what he wanted and crushed anyone who got in his way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What do we do, Grandma?" "We can't go to the police. Sheriff Davidson plays poker with Marcus's father every Friday night. We can't just leave town. We don't have enough money, and Marcus would find us anyway." Rose stood up and walked to the window, peering out through the curtains at the empty street. "There might be a way," she said quietly, "but it's dangerous. And it means you'd have to leave everything behind, forever." "What are you talking about?" She turned back to me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, a hardness, a determination that spoke of secrets I'd never suspected. "Emma, there are people in this world who help girls like you disappear. People who can give you a new identity, a new life, somewhere Marcus Kellerman will never find you. But once you go down that road, there's no coming back. You'd never be Emma Hartwell again." The idea was terrifying and liberating at the same time. To disappear completely, to shed my identity like an old coat and walk away from everything I'd ever known, it seemed impossible. But as I sat there in our kitchen, thinking about Marcus's threats and his promise that I'd be his whether I wanted it or not, impossible began to seem preferable to the alternative. "How do you know about people like that?" I asked. Grandma Rose smiled sadly. "Because, sweetheart, you're not the first woman in our family who's had to run." Over the next hour, she told me a story I'd never heard before. About her own mother, my great-grandmother Margaret, who had fled an abusive husband in Chicago in 1952, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a 6-year-old daughter, my grandmother. About the network of women who had helped them disappear, given them new names, new papers, new lives in Oregon, where Margaret had worked as a seamstress and raised Rose in safety. "The network still exists," Rose explained. "It's smaller now, more careful, but it's still there. Women helping women escape when the law can't or won't protect them. But how do we contact them? How do we even know they'll help?" "Leave that to me," she said. "But Emma, you need to understand what this means. If we do this, Emma Hartwell dies. Everyone you've ever known will think you're dead. I'll have to grieve for you publicly, attend your funeral, accept condolences from neighbors. And you'll have to become someone else completely. New name, new background, new personality if necessary." The weight of what she was describing hit me like a physical blow. To disappear so completely that even my own grandmother would have to pretend I was dead. To walk away from every friend, every memory, every piece of myself that I'd built over 18 years. But then I thought about Marcus's hands on my face, his threats against Rose, his absolute certainty that I belonged to him. I thought about spending the rest of my life trapped in Millbrook, married to a man who saw me as property, watching him destroy anyone who tried to help me. "Do it," I said. "Contact them. Set it up." That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of careful planning, of Rose making mysterious phone calls when she thought I wasn't listening, of gradually preparing for my disappearance without arousing suspicion. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would die in a hiking accident in the mountains, outside town. My body would never be found, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in Oregon's wilderness. Rose would grieve appropriately, and after a suitable period, I'd quietly make my way to a contact in Seattle who would provide me with everything I needed to start over. But Marcus had grown impatient. His visits had become more frequent, more aggressive. 2 days ago, he'd cornered me outside the library and informed me that he'd already spoken to Reverend Mills about performing our wedding ceremony. "I figure a June wedding would be nice," he'd said, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "That gives you 3 months to get used to the idea and plan something appropriate for a Kellerman bride. I'm not marrying you, Marcus. Not ever." His face had darkened. "Emma, I've been very patient with you, more patient than you deserve. But my patience is running out. You can marry me willingly, or you can marry me after I've convinced you that resistance is futile. Either way, you will be my wife." That night, Rose made the final phone call. The timeline had to be moved up. Instead of waiting 2 more weeks for everything to be perfectly arranged, we have to execute the plan immediately, which brought us to tonight, to this cramped bathroom, to the scissors in Rose's shaking hands and the sound of motorcycles growing closer outside. "They're Marcus's friends," Rose whispered, cutting away the last long strand of my hair. "Someone must have seen me buying men's clothes at the thrift store in the next town over. They're suspicious." I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. With my hair cropped short and wearing loose jeans and a flannel shirt, I could pass for a teenage boy if no one looked too closely. The fake ID in my wallet identified me as Ethan Carter, 18 years old. "From Sacramento, California. The contact is expecting you at the truck stop outside Bend," Rose continued, her voice breaking. "You'll recognize him. He's huge. They call him Big Jim Morrison. He runs a ranch up north where you'll be safe while they process your new papers." The sound of engines cut off outside our house. Car doors slammed. Heavy footsteps approached our front porch. "Go," Rose whispered urgently, pushing me toward the bathroom window. "Go now, before they—" The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the whole house. "Rose!" Marcus's voice boomed through the rooms. "Where is she? Where's Emma?" The bathroom window was smaller than I'd remembered, and as I squeezed through it, the metal frame scraped against my ribs. I dropped silently into the flower bed that Rose had tended for 15 years, crushing her prized daffodils under my sneakers. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was destroying something beautiful that she'd nurtured, just like Marcus was trying to destroy me. Behind me, I could hear him tearing through the house, his heavy boots stomping from room to room. "I know she's here," he shouted. "Her car's in the driveway." Rose's voice, calm and defiant despite the terror she must have been feeling. "Emma went for a walk. She needed some air after your visit this afternoon." "Bullshit. Tommy Chun saw you at the thrift store in Riverside yesterday, buying men's clothes. What kind of game are you playing, old woman?" I crouched behind Rose's garden shed, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they could hear it from inside the house. The backyard stretched before me like an ocean, 40 yards of open space between the shed and the tree line that marked the beginning of Miller's Woods. Once I reached those trees, I'd have cover all the way to the old logging road where Rose had hidden her ancient Buick 3 hours ago. A crash from inside the house made me flinch. They were destroying everything, looking for me in closets and under beds like I was a child playing hide and seek. Another voice joined Marcus's, higher, nasal, belonging to his cousin Derek, who dropped out of high school to sell meth and intimidate people for the family business. "Check the basement again," Marcus commanded. "She's got to be here somewhere." This was my chance. I sprinted across the backyard, staying low, my feet pounding against the soft earth. The forest welcomed me with shadows and the musty smell of decomposing leaves. I didn't stop running until I was deep enough in the woods that the house lights were just pinpricks behind me. The Buick was exactly where Rose had promised, parked behind a massive oak tree that had probably been growing when Oregon was still a territory. The keys were taped under the rear bumper, along with an envelope containing $500 in 20s and a handwritten note. "Drive safe, my darling girl. Remember that love follows you wherever you go. Gr." I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting the reality sink in. This was it, the moment Emma Hartwell ceased to exist. When I started this engine, I'd be taking the first step into a life I couldn't even imagine yet. Everything I'd ever been, every memory, every relationship, every small comfort of familiarity would be left behind in this dark forest. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing like an old man with pneumonia. Rose had warned me that. The Buick was temperamental, but she'd assured me it would make the 100-mile journey to Bend if I was gentle with it. I eased it onto the logging road, driving without headlights until I reached the main highway. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of dark countryside and nervous energy. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror could have been Marcus and his friends. Every police car parked at a gas station could have been waiting for me. The fake ID felt like a burning coal in my pocket, and I rehearsed my new identity obsessively. Ethan Carter, 18, traveling from Sacramento to visit relatives in Seattle. Just a normal teenager making a normal trip. The truck stop outside Bend looked like something from a movie about serial killers, all harsh fluorescent lighting and diesel fumes, populated by tired-looking drivers who moved like sleepwalkers. I parked the Buick in the darkest corner of the lot and made my way inside, trying to walk like a teenage boy instead of a terrified girl. The restaurant was nearly empty except for a few truckers, nursing coffee, and a waitress who looked like she'd been working double shifts since the Carter administration. But there, in a corner booth that gave him a clear view of both entrances, sat the most enormous man I'd ever seen. Big Jim Morrison looked like he'd been carved from a mountain. He had to be at least 6'8", with shoulders that could have carried a piano and hands like dinner plates, wrapped around a coffee cup that looked like a child's toy in his grip. His hair was silver gray, tied back in a ponytail that reached halfway down his back, and his face was weathered like old leather. But his eyes were gentle, almost paternal, and when he looked up and saw me scanning the restaurant, he nodded once. I walked over to his table on legs that felt like water. "Are you Jim? Sit down, son." His voice was a rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. "You look like you could use some food." It took me a moment to realize he was playing his part, treating me like the teenage boy I was supposed to be. I slid into the booth across from him, hyper-aware of every gesture, every inflection in my voice. "I'm not really hungry," I said, then immediately regretted it. Teenage boys were always hungry, weren't they? Jim studied me with those gentle eyes. "When's the last time you ate?" I couldn't remember. The events of the day had driven all thoughts of food from my mind. "This morning, I think." He signaled the waitress without taking his eyes off me. "Bring us 2 burgers, extra fries, and a couple of Cokes," he told her. Then to me, "You eat when food's available, son. That's the first rule of survival." While we waited for the food, Jim asked me careful questions about my trip. Where was I headed? Did I have family waiting for me? Was there anyone who might be looking for me? His questions were casual, the kind an interested adult might ask any teenager, but I could tell he was gathering intelligence, assessing my situation. "My grandmother says you can help me." I said quietly, when the waitress was out of earshot. Your grandmother's a smart woman. Tough too. Takes guts to do what she's doing tonight. He leaned back in the booth, and the vinyl creaked under his weight. But we'll talk about that later. Right now, you need to focus on being Ethan Carter from Sacramento. Practice it. Live it. Because for the next few weeks, that's who you are. The food arrived, and Jim was right. I was hungrier than I'd realized. As I ate, he told me about his ranch, talking loud enough for anyone listening to hear a perfectly normal conversation between a rancher and a young man looking for work. It's honest work, he said, cutting his burger into manageable pieces with hands that moved surprisingly gracefully for their size. We run cattle mostly, some horses. Remote location, up in the Cascade foothills. Good place for a young man to learn responsibility, earn some money for college. But his eyes told a different story. They said it's a safe place. It's a place where people who need to disappear can do so without questions. It's a place where Marcus Kellerman's influence means nothing. I'd like that, sir, I said, remembering to keep my voice low and slightly rough. I'm good with animals. I'm sure you are. Jim smiled, and for the first time since I'd climbed through that bathroom window, I felt something that might have been hoped. We finished eating in comfortable silence, and then Jim stood up, leaving a 20 on the table for a meal that couldn't have cost more than $12. My truck's the blue Peterbilt at Pump 3. Give me 5 minutes, then come out. We've got a long drive ahead of us. I watched him walk away, marveling at how someone so large could move so quietly. Then I sat alone in the booth, counting seconds, and trying not to think about what Rose was going through back in Millbrook. Had Marcus given up searching the house? Had he bought her story about me going for a walk? Or were they still there, turning her life upside down in their rage and frustration? When 5 minutes had passed, I made my way outside. Jim's truck was indeed massive, a gleaming blue monster with a sleeper cab and enough chrome to blind someone in daylight. He was checking his tires when I approached, running his hands along the treads with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for decades. "Hop in," he said without looking up. "We'll be driving through the night." The cab of the Kavitha truck was like a small apartment, complete with a bunk, a mini refrigerator, and a CB radio that crackled occasionally with the voices of other drivers. Jim adjusted his mirrors, checked his gauges, and pulled out of the truck stop with the smooth competence of a man who'd driven millions of miles without incident. For the first hour, we drove in silence through the Oregon darkness. The highway unrolled before us like a black ribbon, marked by the occasional lights of a farmhouse or the red glow of another truck's taillights. I found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks, lulled by the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the gentle swaying of the cab. "Tell me about Marcus Kellerman," Jim said suddenly, his voice cutting through my drowsiness. The name hit me like a slap. I'd been so focused on escaping that I hadn't really processed what it meant to talk about him with someone else, to share the details of my nightmare with a stranger. I struggled to find words that would capture the full horror of what Marcus represented. He's used to getting what he wants. His family owns most of the town, and he thinks that includes the people in it. Including you, especially me. The words tasted bitter. He decided I was going to be his wife, and when I said no, he made it clear that my opinion didn't matter. Jim nodded grimly. Men like that see women as possessions. Things to be collected and displayed. They can't comprehend that you might have your own thoughts and feelings about the matter. Have you met men like him before? Son, I've been helping people escape from men like Marcus Kellerman for 23 years. They all follow the same playbook: intimidation, isolation, escalation. They use their money and power to destroy anyone who opposes them, and they always believe they're justified in doing so. The truck climbed steadily into the mountains, the engine working harder as the grade increased. Through the windshield, I could see stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. More stars than I'd ever seen from Millbrook. The air was thinner here, cleaner, and despite everything I'd lost, I felt something that might have been freedom. Where exactly are we going? I asked. My ranch is about 40 miles northeast of Mount Hood, up a logging road that most people don't even know exists. We're completely off the grid solar power, well water, satellite internet. When we need it. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away, and he's a retired Marine who minds his own business. How many people know about this place? Jim glanced at me, and I saw approval in his eyes. Good question, security thinking. The answer is very few. The people who need to know, and nobody else. The folks who run the network are careful about compartmentalizing information, the network. Rose mentioned it, but she didn't explain much. Your grandmother was protecting you by not telling you too much. The less you know about the overall operation, the less you can compromise if something goes wrong. He shifted gears as we crested a hill, the truck's headlights illuminating a sign that read, Mount Hood National Forest. But I can tell you the basics. We're a loose organization of people, ranchers, truck drivers, small business owners, retired law enforcement who believe that sometimes the system fails women like you. When the courts can't or won't protect someone, when the police are compromised or intimidated, when a woman's only choice is to disappear or die, we step in. How did Rose contact you? Through a friend of a friend of a friend. The network operates on trust and word of mouth. We don't advertise, we don't have a website, and we sure as hell don't leave paper trails. Someone vouches for someone else, and information gets passed along through channels that can't be traced. I thought about my great-grandmother Margaret, fleeing Chicago in 1952, with nothing but hope and determination. Rose said our family has used the network before. Different network, same idea. Women have always helped other women escape dangerous situations. What's changed is that we've gotten more organized, more sophisticated. We've learned from past mistakes. The truck turned off the main highway onto a smaller road that wound deeper into the forest. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to little more than 2 ruts separated by a strip of weeds. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck, and I had the unsettling feeling that we were driving into a place where civilization had never quite taken hold. Almost there, Jim said, reading my nervousness. I know it seems remote, but that's the point. Marcus Kellerman's money and influence don't mean much out here. 20 minutes later, we emerged from the forest into a clearing dominated by a sprawling log house that looked like it had grown from the landscape itself. Outbuildings dotted the property, barns, corrals, equipment sheds, and I could see the silhouettes of cattle grazing in moonlit pastures. Security lights flickered on as we approached, triggered by motion sensors, but the overall effect was welcoming rather than fortress-like. Welcome to the Morrison Ranch, Jim said, bringing the truck to a stop in front of the main house. For the next few weeks, this is home. As I climbed down from the cab, my legs stiff from hours of sitting, I breathed air that smelled of pine, trees and wood smoke, and something else, something that took me a moment to identify. Safety. For the first time in months, I felt truly safe. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I heard the distant sound of engines echoing through the forest. Behind us, Jim heard it too, and his expression hardened. Get inside, he said quietly, his gentle demeanor evaporating like morning mist. Now, the sound grew louder, and I realized with a sinking heart that our escape might not have been as clean as we'd hoped. Somehow Marcus had followed us here, to this remote sanctuary in the mountains, and he was bringing friends. The front door of the ranch house swung open before we reached it, revealing a woman who looked like she could wrestle bears and win. She stood about 5'6", with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. But it was her eyes that caught my attention, sharp, intelligent, and completely unafraid. Margaret. "We've got company coming," Jim said without preamble as he ushered me inside. "Multiple vehicles, maybe 10 minutes out." Margaret nodded once, as if unexpected visitors in the middle of the night were a routine occurrence. "How many?" "Hard to say. At least 3 engines, maybe more." She was already moving, crossing the spacious living room with purposeful strides. The interior of the house surprised me. I'd expected rustic simplicity, but this was warm and sophisticated, with Native American artwork on the walls and furniture that looked both comfortable and expensive. Margaret pulled back a curtain and peered out into the darkness. "Headlights," she confirmed. "Still in the trees, but getting closer." She turned to me, sizing me up with a glance. "You must be Ethan. I'm Margaret Morrison, Jim's wife. How much does the boy know about operational procedures?" It took me a moment to realize she was talking about me, maintaining the fiction that I was a teenage boy even in this crisis. "I don't know anything about any procedures," I admitted. "Then listen carefully, because we don't have time for explanations." Margaret walked to what looked like an ordinary bookshelf and pressed something hidden behind a row of volumes. The entire shelf swung inward like a door, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. "This leads to a safe room we built when we designed the house. Food, water, communications equipment, separate ventilation system. If things go bad, you go down there and you don't come out until one of us gives you the all clear. What about you and Jim?" "We've been handling situations like this for 2 decades, Jim said, checking the action on a rifle he'd pulled from a gun cabinet I hadn't noticed before. "These people, whoever they are, they're trespassing on private property in the middle of the night. In Oregon, that gives us certain legal advantages." Margaret was at another cabinet, removing what looked like night vision equipment. "The ranch has motion sensors positioned along all the access roads, cameras too. If they're here for trouble, we'll have video evidence of them bringing weapons onto our property." The sound of engines grew louder, and through the windows I could see the first flicker of headlights emerging from the tree line. My stomach clenched as I recognized the distinctive rumble of Marcus's pickup truck, the same sound that had haunted my nightmares for weeks. "How did they find us?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Jim's expression was grim. "Someone talked, or someone followed us, or someone's been watching the network for longer than we realized." He handed Margaret a radio. "Either way, they've made a serious mistake coming here." The vehicles I could see now that there were 4 of them, pulled into the clearing in front of the house and arranged themselves in a semicircle, their headlights blazing like spotlights. Car doors slammed, and I counted 6 figures moving in the harsh white glare. One of them was definitely Marcus, his bulky silhouette unmistakable, even at a distance. "Jim Morrison." Marcus's voice carried clearly across the night air, amplified by the silence of the mountains. "We know you've got her. Send out Emma Hartwell, and nobody gets hurt," Margaret snorted. "Nobody gets hurt." As if they drove 300 miles into the mountains for a friendly conversation. She was adjusting something on her rifle scope, her movements calm and professional. "Jim, you take the high ground. I'll handle the diplomatic approach." "Wait," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You can't fight them. There are too many, and Marcus, he's dangerous. He'll hurt you." "Son," Jim said gently, but with steel underneath, "that man and his friends just made the mistake of bringing violence to our home. We didn't ask for this fight, but we're damn well going to finish it." He disappeared up a staircase that led to what I assumed was a second floor or attic, moving with surprising stealth for such a large man. Margaret checked her weapon one more time, then walked to the front door. "Emma Hartwell died in a hiking accident 3 days ago," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "I read about it in the papers. Tragic story, young girl, bright future, never found the body." "Cut the bullshit," Marcus shouted back. "We know. She's here. We followed the old woman's car to the truck stop, saw her get in your rig." My heart sank. They had followed the Buick somehow, which meant they'd probably interrogated Rose to find out about our escape plan. The thought of my grandmother facing Marcus's rage while I was safely hidden here made me sick. The old woman? Margaret's voice carried a note of confusion that sounded completely genuine. Son, I think you've been drinking too much of your own moonshine. The only person I've seen tonight is a young man named Ethan Carter, and he's looking for work at the ranch. There was a long pause, and I could see the figures in the headlight glare conferring among themselves. Marcus stepped forward, his face twisted with frustration. We're coming in, he announced. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind us taking a look around. Actually, I mind very much, Margaret replied, and now her voice carried an edge that could have cut glass. This is private property, and it's 3 in the morning. You have no warrant, no legal authority, and no invitation. I suggest you turn around and drive back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Lady, you don't know who you're dealing with. I'm Marcus Kellerman. My family has connections you can't even imagine. We can make your life very difficult. Margaret laughed, and the sound was genuinely amused. Marcus Kellerman. From Millbrook, Oregon. Population 847. Median income $31,000. Main industries farming and meth production. Yes, I'm terrified of your vast influence here in the middle of nowhere. The casual dismissal in her voice was like gasoline on Marcus's rage. I could see him gesturing angrily to his companions, and one of them, I thought it might be his cousin Derek, started walking toward the house. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Margaret said conversationally. Derek kept walking, and suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the night air. Derek yelped and jumped backward as dirt exploded inches from his feet. That was a warning, Jim's voice boomed from somewhere above us. The next one won't be. You shot at me. Derek screamed, his voice high with terror and indignation. Son, if I'd shot at you, you'd be dead, Jim replied calmly. I shot at the ground near you, which is a perfectly legal way to warn trespassers off my property. Marcus was shouting orders to his men, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. This wasn't going according to his plan. He was used to intimidating small-town merchants and defenseless women, not dealing with people who shot back. Look, he called out, trying a different approach. Maybe we can work something out here. I'm willing to pay for information. Say $10,000 for anyone who's seen Emma Hartwell. I told you, Margaret said patiently. Emma Hartwell is dead. But even if she wasn't, do you really think you could buy me for $10,000? 20,000. You're not listening. Let me explain this in terms you might understand. I wouldn't sell you directions to hell for $20 million. And hell is exactly where you're headed if you don't get off my property. I found myself admiring Margaret's style, even as terror churned in my stomach. She was treating Marcus like an annoying insect, utterly unimpressed by his bluster and threats. It was probably the first time in his life that someone had dismissed him so completely, but Marcus wasn't used to being dismissed, and that made him dangerous. Fine, he snarled. We'll do this the hard way. I saw him reach into his truck and emerge with what looked like a shotgun. His companions were arming themselves, too. And suddenly the situation escalated from tense confrontation to imminent violence. Get down, Margaret barked, diving away from the window just as the first shot shattered the glass where she'd been standing. Jim, light them up! The night exploded into chaos. Margaret rolled behind a heavy wooden table and returned fire, her rifle spitting flame in the darkness. From upstairs, Jim's weapon boomed like thunder, and I heard someone outside scream in pain or fear. I crouched behind the couch, paralyzed by the unreality of it all. 3 hours ago, I'd been Emma Hartwell, hiding in my grandmother's bathroom. Now I was Ethan Carter, caught in a gunfight between mountain ranchers and small-town thugs. The transformation felt like something from a fever dream. Ethan. Margaret. shouted over the gunfire, "Safe room now." But I couldn't move. Through the broken window, I could see Marcus advancing on the house, his face illuminated by muzzle flashes and twisted with a rage that bordered on madness. This was my fault. These good people were risking their lives because I'd brought danger. To their doorstep, another window exploded inward, showering the living room with glass. Margaret cursed and shifted position, trying to get a clear shot at the attackers. From upstairs, Jim's rifle continued its steady, methodical firing, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. "They're flanking left," Jim called down. "3 of them are moving toward the kitchen." Margaret nodded and rolled toward a different window, her movements fluid and professional. She'd done this before, I realized. Maybe not exactly this, but something similar. She and Jim weren't just ranchers who happened to help people disappear. They were trained for this kind of confrontation. The front door exploded inward, and Derek burst through, wild-eyed and holding a pistol in shaking hands. He spotted me immediately, despite my position behind the couch. "There!" he screamed. "That's her. That's Emma." Time seemed to slow as he raised the pistol. I could see his finger tightening on the trigger, could see the madness in his eyes, could see my death approaching at 900 feet per second. Margaret's rifle cracked, and Derek spun around like a dancer, his pistol flying from his hands as he crashed into the wall. He slid to the floor, clutching his shoulder and whimpering. "Flesh wound," Margaret said clinically, not even breathing hard. "He'll live, assuming his friends get him to a hospital sometime tonight." But Derek's shout had given away my position. And now Marcus knew exactly where I was. Through the shattered doorway, I could see him organizing his remaining men for a final assault. They had us outnumbered and outgunned, and they were motivated by the kind of rage that made men do stupid, dangerous things. "Margaret," I said quietly, "I'm going to give myself up." "The hell you are." She didn't even look at me, keeping her attention focused on the windows. Nobody gives up on my ranch. Jim and I didn't build this place as a surrender station. But they'll kill you. They'll kill both of you, and it'll be my fault. Son, men like Marcus Kellerman have been trying to kill people like Jim and me for 23 years. We're still here, and a lot of them aren't, she smiled grimly. Besides, they made one crucial mistake. What's that? They assumed this was about you. It's not. It's about the fact that they brought guns to our home and started shooting at us. That makes it personal. From upstairs, Jim's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Margaret, package delivered." I had no idea what that meant, but Margaret grinned like a wolf. "Outstanding. Ethan, you might want to cover your ears." The question of why died on my lips as the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard filled the night air. The whoop-whoop of helicopter rotors, growing closer by the second. Marcus and his remaining men were looking up at the sky in confusion when the aircraft appeared over the tree line, a sleek black machine that looked like it had stepped out of a military thriller. A spotlight blazed from its belly, turning night into day and pinning the attackers like insects under a microscope. "This is the Oregon State Police." A voice boomed from speakers mounted on the helicopter. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground." Now, the effect was instantaneous. 2 of Marcus's men immediately threw down their guns and lay face down in the dirt. A third tried to run and was tackled by what appeared to be a SWAT officer who'd rappelled from the helicopter while I wasn't looking. Only Marcus remained standing, his shotgun pointed at the sky like he could somehow shoot down the aircraft. "Through sheer force of will, this is your final warning." The voice from the helicopter commanded, "Drop the weapon." Instead, Marcus turned the shotgun toward the house, toward the broken window where he could see me crouching behind the couch. His face was a mask of pure hatred, and I knew with absolute certainty that he intended to kill me, even if it meant dying in the process. The sniper's bullet took him center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground like a cut string. His shotgun discharged harmlessly into the air as he fell, and then the clearing was silent, except for the helicopter's rotors and the moaning of wounded men. "Well," Margaret said conversationally, lowering her rifle, "that was exciting. The aftermath of violence is always stranger than the violence itself. One moment, bullets were flying and people were screaming, and the next, uniformed officers were methodically processing a crime scene while paramedics worked on wounded men. The helicopter had landed in the ranch's main pasture, its rotors winding. Down with a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo the exhaustion I felt in my bones, I sat on Margaret's front porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild mountain air, watching a parade of law enforcement officials document what had just happened. Derek was being loaded into an ambulance, conscious but pale, his shoulder bandaged and his wrists cuffed to the gurney. Two of Marcus's other accomplices sat in the back of a police van, looking like they wished they'd never heard of Millbrook, Oregon. Marcus himself lay under a tarp near his pickup truck, his reign of terror ended by a single precisely placed bullet. "How are you holding up, Ethan?" The voice belonged to Captain Sarah Chun of the Oregon State Police, a compact Asian woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm authority that comes from handling crisis situations. She'd been the first officer off the helicopter, and she'd spent the last hour interviewing everyone involved in the shooting. I still felt strange being called Ethan, but I was beginning to understand that Emma Hartwell really was dead, at least as far as the official world was concerned. The person sitting on this porch, giving statements to police officers, was a teenage boy from Sacramento who'd stumbled into a dangerous situation while looking for ranch work. "I'm okay," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. "Just trying to process everything that happened." Captain Chun sat down beside me, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. "That's understandable. It's not every day a job interview turns into a firefight." She was playing along with the cover story, treating me exactly like what my fake ID claimed I was. But there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew more than she was letting on, that she understood the real reason I was here. "Captain Chun," I said carefully, "how did you get here so fast? I mean, we're in the middle of nowhere, and that helicopter showed up like it was waiting around the corner." She smiled, and for a moment, her professional facade slipped. "Jim Morrison has friends in high places, Ethan. Friends who keep an eye on his property and respond quickly when there's trouble. Let's just say that certain elements of law enforcement are very interested in protecting people like the Morrisons and the work they do." Before I could ask what she meant by that, Jim appeared around the corner of the house, looking none the worse for wear despite having spent the last hour in a gun battle. He was followed by a man I didn't recognize, tall, thin, wearing an expensive suit that looked wildly out of place at a mountain ranch at 4 in the morning. "Ethan," Jim said, "I'd like you to meet Federal Marshal Robert Hayes. He's got some things to discuss with you." Marshal Hayes extended his hand, and I shook it automatically, still trying to process the word federal. Why was a federal marshal involved in what seemed like a local crime? "Mr. Carter," Hayes said, settling into a chair across from me, "I understand you've had quite an eventful evening. That's one way to put it. Before we go any further, I want you to understand that you're not in any trouble. You're a victim here, and my job is to make sure you stay safe." He opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "But I also need to explain some things about Marcus Kellerman and why tonight's events are more significant than they might appear." I glanced at Jim and Margaret, who had joined us on the porch. Their expressions were serious but not worried, like parents about to explain a complicated family situation to their child. "Marcus Kellerman wasn't just a local bully," Hayes continued. "For the past 3 years, he's been under federal investigation for human trafficking." The words hit me like a physical blow. Human trafficking? Young women specifically. "We believe he's been abducting girls from small towns across the Pacific Northwest and selling them to buyers in other states, sometimes other countries. Hayes's voice was matter-of-fact, but I could see the anger burning behind his professional demeanor. We've been trying to build a case against him for months, but his victims either disappeared completely or were too terrified to testify. My mouth went dry as the implications sank in. You think he was planning to... We think you would have been his next victim, yes. The forced marriage was probably just the beginning. Once he had legal control over you, once he'd isolated you completely from any support system, you would have vanished. Another tragic case of a young woman who couldn't handle married life and ran away from home. I felt sick. All those weeks of thinking Marcus just wanted to possess me, to keep me trapped in Millbrook as his unwilling wife. I'd never imagined something so much worse. How many? I asked quietly. We're not sure. At least 12 that we can document, possibly more. Girls between 16 and 22, all from small towns, all with limited family support or connections. Hayes pulled out a series of photographs and spread them on the table. Have you ever seen any of these women? I forced myself to look at the pictures, though every instinct screamed at me to turn away. Young faces, smiling and innocent, stared back at me from what looked like school. Photos or family snapshots. They could have been my classmates, my neighbors, my friends. I don't recognize any of them, I said. But that doesn't mean anything. Marcus traveled a lot for his family's business. He could have met them anywhere. Exactly. Hayes gathered up the photos with practiced efficiency. Which brings us to why you're so important. Ethan, you're the first person who successfully escaped from Marcus Kellerman. You're also the first person willing and able to testify about his methods of intimidation and control. But I'm supposed to be dead. Emma Hartwell died in a hiking accident, remember? Emma Hartwell died, Captain Chen said, but Ethan Carter witnessed Marcus Kellerman's criminal behavior firsthand. Ethan Carter can testify about threats, stalking, assault, and conspiracy. And Ethan Carter's testimony can help us build cases against the other members of the trafficking network. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, Jim and Margaret, who had risked their lives to protect me. Captain Chun, who had arrived like the cavalry in my darkest hour. Marshal Hayes, who was offering me a chance to fight back against the monster who had terrorized me for months. What would that mean exactly, testifying? It means helping us make sure that what Marcus did to you never happens to another girl, Hayes said simply. It means using your experience to save lives. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat. For months, I'd thought only about escaping, about getting away from Marcus and starting over somewhere safe. I'd never considered that my experience might be valuable to anyone else, that my suffering might serve a purpose beyond just surviving. There's something else, Margaret said quietly. Something you need to know about your grandmother. My heart clenched. In all the excitement and terror of the night, I'd managed to push thoughts of Rose to the back of my mind. But now Margaret's tone brought all my fears rushing back. Is she okay? Did Marcus hurt her? She's alive, Margaret said quickly, but she's in the hospital. Apparently, after Marcus and his friends left Millbrook to come after us, Rose called the sheriff and reported that you were missing. She said you'd gone hiking alone and hadn't come back, that she was worried you'd had an accident. She was maintaining the cover story. Exactly. But then she had what appears to be a heart attack. The stress of everything, your disappearance, Marcus's threats, the fear for your safety, it was too much for her system. I felt the world tilt around me. Rose, who had sacrificed everything to save me, who had endured Marcus's interrogation, and maintained our deception even as her heart was literally breaking. I have to see her, I said, standing up so quickly that the blanket fell from my shoulders. I have to go back to Millbrook. Ethan, Jim said gently, you can't. Emma Hartwell is dead, remember? If you show up at the hospital, it'll blow your cover and put everyone in danger. I don't care about the cover. She's my grandmother. She's the only family I have left. And she's the one who made the sacrifice to give you a new life, Marshall Hayes said. Honor that sacrifice by staying alive and staying hidden. The logic was inescapable, but it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Rose was lying in a hospital bed, possibly dying, and I couldn't even hold her hand because I was supposed to be dead. There is another option, Captain Chun said slowly, as if she were thinking out loud. It's risky, but it might work. Everyone turned to look at her, and she took a deep breath before continuing. The official story is that Emma Hartwell went hiking alone and disappeared, presumably dead. But what if we found Ethan Carter injured on a mountain trail, suffering from amnesia? After a fall? What if Ethan had been hiking in the same area and witnessed something that might be connected to Emma's disappearance? Hayes frowned. That's a lot of coincidences. The best cover stories usually are. People accept coincidences more readily than they accept conspiracies. Chun was warming to the idea, her voice gaining confidence. Ethan gets taken to the same hospital where Rose Hartwell is recovering. During his stay, he forms a connection with the grieving grandmother of a missing girl. She takes an interest in his recovery, maybe even offers to help him since he has no family in the area. And if his amnesia gradually clears, Margaret added, catching on, he might remember seeing a group of men in the mountains around the time Emma disappeared. Men who were acting suspiciously. It's brilliant, Jim said. It gives Ethan a reason to be in contact with Rose while maintaining his cover identity. And it provides a plausible explanation for his knowledge of Marcus's activities. I felt a surge of hope for the first time since Margaret had told me about Rose's condition. It was a complex plan, full of potential pitfalls, but it offered something I'd thought was impossible, a chance to see my grandmother again. What about the trafficking investigation? I asked Hayes. Would this interfere with that? Actually, it might help. If Ethan Carter witnessed suspicious activity in the mountains, that gives us another angle to investigate Marcus's associates. We can use his testimony to pressure the survivors into revealing more about the network. The plan was coming together, but I could see potential problems everywhere. What if Rose doesn't recognize me? What if she says something that gives away my real identity? Your grandmother is a smart woman, Margaret said. She understands what's happening and should play her part. Besides, people see what they expect to see. Rose Hartwell is expecting to grieve for her granddaughter and worry about her own recovery. She's not expecting to see Emma walking around disguised as a teenage boy. We spent the next hour working out the details. I would be discovered by a park ranger at dawn, confused and injured, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The head injury would explain any gaps in my story and give me time to establish my cover identity, while my amnesia gradually cleared. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I found myself back in the passenger seat of Jim's truck, heading toward a carefully orchestrated discovery that would give Ethan Carter a plausible reason to exist in the world. In the distance, I could hear the helicopter spinning up its rotors, preparing to transport the wounded and the arrested back to civilization. You ready for this? Jim asked as we bumped along the forest road. I thought about Rose lying in a hospital bed, about the 12 missing girls in Marshall Hayes's photographs, about the chance to transform my nightmare into something that might save other people from the same fate. No, I said honestly, but I'm going to do it anyway. That's the spirit. Jim smiled, and in the growing light, I could see the approval in his eyes. Emma Hartwell was a scared girl running for her life. Ethan Carter is someone who fights back. As we reached the main trail where the park ranger was waiting to find me, I realized that Jim was right. Emma Hartwell had died in that bathroom in Millbrook, but she'd given birth to someone stronger, someone who could face the future with courage, instead of fear. The last piece of my old life was about to begin. The hardest part about pretending to have amnesia wasn't remembering to act confused. It was suppressing the urge to react. when people said things that should have been familiar to me. Sitting in the emergency room at Cascade General Hospital, wrapped in a thermal blanket and sporting a carefully applied head bandage, I had to force myself to look blank when the intake nurse mentioned that this was the same hospital where that poor Hartwell girl's grandmother was recovering. Hartwell? I repeated, practicing the slightly dazed tone that Dr. Patricia Williams had coached me on during the ambulance ride. That name sounds familiar, but I can't. Everything's so fuzzy. The nurse, a motherly woman named Linda Kowalski, patted my arm sympathetically. Don't worry, honey. Head injuries can scramble things up for a while, but it usually comes back. You just focus on getting better. Dr. Williams had been brought into the deception by Marshall Hayes, who'd explained the situation during a brief, encrypted phone call while I was being discovered on the mountain trail. She was a trauma surgeon who'd worked with federal authorities before, helping to establish cover stories for witnesses and victims in sensitive cases. Her examination had been thorough but carefully orchestrated, documenting injuries that supported the amnesia story without causing any real harm. Ethan's showing classic signs of retrograde amnesia, she'd told the emergency room staff. The head trauma seems to have affected his short-term memory formation. He remembers basic things, his name, general knowledge, but recent events are fragmented or missing entirely. Now, 6 hours later, I was being wheeled through the hospital corridors toward a room in the same wing where Rose was recovering. The timing was perfect. Visiting hours were just beginning, and I would have a chance to establish my cover story before 2. Many people were around to ask complicated questions. My room was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the hospital's parking lot. As the orderly helped me into bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror mounted on the opposite wall. The boy looking back at me was a stranger, short brown hair, clothes that hung loose on my frame, a face that looked younger and more vulnerable than I felt. The transformation was so complete that I barely recognized myself. Is there anyone we should call? Linda asked, checking my 4-line. Family? Friends? I don't think so, I said, letting confusion creep into my voice. I remember being from Sacramento, but the details are just gone. I keep thinking there's something important I'm supposed to remember, but it won't come. The doctor says that's normal. Sometimes the memories return gradually, sometimes all at once. You just need to be patient with yourself. After Linda left, I lay in the hospital bed listening to the familiar sounds of medical equipment and distant conversations. For the first time since climbing through that bathroom window, I had a moment to truly process what had happened to me. Emma Hartwell, the girl who'd worried about chemistry exams and college applications, really was gone. In her place was Ethan Carter, a young man with no past and an uncertain future. But Ethan Carter had something Emma Hartwell had never possessed, the power to fight back. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. Come in, I called, expecting another nurse or maybe Dr. Williams with test results. Instead, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, and my heart nearly stopped. Rose looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the hospital gown and the oxygen cannula under her nose. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of pain and sleepless nights. But her gaze was as sharp as ever, and when she looked at me, I saw recognition flicker across her features for just an instant before she composed herself. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I'm Rose Hartwell. I'm staying in the room next door, and I heard you were found on the mountain trails. I wondered if you might have seen my granddaughter. The word granddaughter hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to maintain my cover. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartwell. I wish I could help, but my memory of the last few days is pretty much gone. The doctors say I have amnesia from the head injury. Rose moved closer to my bed, and I could see her studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. What's your name, dear? Ethan Carter. At least that's what my ID says. I remember being from Sacramento, but everything else is just fragments. Ethan. She said my name like she was testing how it felt in her mouth. That's a nice name. Strong name. We talked for 20 minutes, and it was both the easiest and most difficult conversation of my life. Easy because I was talking to the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world, and difficult because I had to pretend she was a stranger. Rose played her part perfectly, asking gentle questions about my condition and sharing carefully edited stories about her granddaughter's disappearance. Emma was 18, she said, settling into the visitor's chair. Bright girl, planning to go to college in Portland. She went hiking alone 3 days ago and never came back. The search teams found her car at the trailhead, but no trace of her. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. That must be horrible for you. Not knowing is the worst part. I keep hoping she'll walk through that door. But the police think, well, they think she probably fell somewhere and can't be found. Rose's voice broke slightly, and I realized she wasn't entirely acting. The pain of believing I was dead, even temporarily, was real. Maybe she'll turn up, I offered. Maybe she's injured somewhere, like I was, and just can't get to help. Rose smiled sadly. That's kind of you to say, Ethan. But it's been 3 days, and these mountains can be unforgiving. Over the next few days, Rose and I developed a routine. She would visit during the afternoons, sometimes bringing books or magazines, always maintaining the fiction that we were simply two patients who'd struck up a friendship. But during those visits, she was able to fill me in on what had happened in Millbrook after my disappearance. The official story was holding up perfectly. Emma Hartwell's hiking accident was accepted without question, especially given Marcus Kellerman's very public death during the raid on the Morrison Ranch. The surviving members of his group were facing federal charges related to weapons violations and assault on federal officers, but the trafficking investigation was being kept classified. The whole town's in shock, Rose told me during one of our conversations. Marcus was always trouble, but nobody expected anything like this. His father's trying to distance the family from what happened, claiming Marcus went rogue. What about you? Are you safe? Rose glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. Sheriff Davidson came by the house yesterday, asking questions about Emma's state of mind before the hiking trip. I think he suspects something isn't right about the timing, but he can't prove anything. We need to be careful. Oh, I'm being careful. Playing the grieving grandmother to perfection. Half the towns brought me casseroles and condolence cards. She smiled grimly. Amazing how sympathetic people become when they think you can't hurt them anymore. On my 4th day in the hospital, Dr. Williams announced that my amnesia was beginning to clear. I started remembering fragments of my time on the mountain, including vague images of men in vehicles who seemed to be searching for something or someone. It's coming back in pieces, I told Marshal Hayes when he visited, posing as a federal investigator following up on the mountain incident. I remember hearing engines, seeing headlights through the trees. There were several men, and they seemed agitated about something. Hayes played his part perfectly, taking detailed notes and asking follow-up questions that would support the official narrative. Can you describe any of these men? Did you hear them talking about anything specific? One of them was big, muscular. He seemed to be in charge. The others called him Marcus, I think. I paused, as if struggling to remember. They were looking for someone. A girl. They kept saying they needed to find her before she could cause problems. The statement was carefully crafted to support the trafficking investigation without revealing too much about my real identity. Hayes would use it as evidence that Marcus's group had been actively hunting for victims in the area where Emma Hartwell had supposedly disappeared. But the most important breakthrough came on my 5th day, when Rose was visiting during her afternoon break from her own treatment schedule. We were discussing my gradual memory recovery when she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. The strangest thing, she said quietly, is that they never found Emma's body. In all the years I've lived here, when someone falls in those mountains, the search teams usually find something: clothing, equipment, remains. But with Emma, it's like she just vanished. Maybe that's good news, I suggested. Maybe it means she's still alive somewhere. Rose shook her head. The police are convinced she's dead. They've called off the active search. But there's been talk around town, whispers that maybe Emma didn't go hiking at all. Maybe she ran away. Why would people think that? Because of Marcus. Everyone knew he was interested in her, and some people saw them arguing at the hardware store a few weeks before she disappeared. Now that he's dead and can't defend himself, people are starting to talk about how aggressive he'd become. This was news to me, and potentially dangerous news. If people in Millbrook were beginning to suspect that Emma had fled rather than died, it could undermine the entire cover story. What kind of talk? I asked carefully. Nothing specific yet, just speculation. But Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store mentioned that she'd seen Emma looking scared in the weeks before the disappearance. And Pete Sullivan from the diner said Marcus had been asking questions about Emma's schedule, when she worked, when she went shopping. I felt a chill of recognition. Even after death, Marcus was still causing problems, still threatening my safety through the suspicions his behavior had aroused. Rose, I said quietly, what if people start to believe Emma ran away? What would that mean? She was quiet for a long moment, understanding the implications immediately. It would mean they might start looking for her. Really looking, not just assuming she's dead in the mountains. And if they found evidence that she'd planned to disappear, it would lead them back to me. To us, to the network that helped her. Rose's face was pale, but her voice remained steady. We'd have to accelerate the timeline. That evening, after Rose had returned to her room, I lay awake thinking about the delicate balance we were trying to maintain. Emma Hartwell needed to stay dead, but Ethan Carter needed to become real enough to survive scrutiny. The trafficking investigation required my testimony, but giving that testimony would put both Rose and the Morrison Ranch at risk if anyone connected Ethan Carter to Emma Hartwell. The solution, when it came to me, was both simple and terrifying. Ethan Carter would have to leave Millbrook forever, but not before ensuring that Emma Hartwell's story was told in a way that would protect everyone who'd helped her. The next morning, I asked Dr. Williams to contact Marshall Hayes. It was time to move to the next phase of the plan, the phase that would either secure my new identity permanently or destroy everything we'd worked to build. I want to testify, I told Hayes when he arrived. Not just about what I saw on the mountain, but about everything. The whole trafficking operation, Marcus's methods, the network of people who helped girls disappear. Hayes frowned. Ethan, we've talked about this. Your testimony as a witness to suspicious activity is valuable, but we can't risk exposing your real identity by having you testify about things you couldn't possibly know. What if Ethan Carter's amnesia clears completely? What if he remembers not just seeing Marcus on the mountain, but overhearing conversations about other victims? What if he becomes not just a witness to one incident, but a key informant in a federal investigation? The idea was audacious, and I could see Hayes working through the implications. If Ethan Carter could provide detailed information about Marcus's trafficking operation, information that could only have come from extended observation or intimate knowledge, it would make him incredibly valuable to the federal case. But it would also make him a target for anyone else involved in the network. You're talking about going into witness protection, Hayes said slowly. Full identity change, relocation, federal protection for the rest of your life. I'm talking about making sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else, I replied. And I'm talking about protecting the people who saved my life. Through the window, I could see Rose walking slowly through the hospital's garden, her oxygen tank trailing behind her on a small cart. She looked frail and vulnerable, but I knew she possessed the same steel that had enabled her to cut my hair and send me into the night. She'd given me a new life. Now it was time to make that life count for something. The federal courthouse in Portland was nothing like what I'd imagined. Instead of the imposing marble columns and grand architecture I'd seen in movies, it was a modern glass building that could have housed any corporate headquarters. But as Ethan Carter walked through the metal detectors and into the witness preparation room, I felt the weight of history pressing down on me like a physical force. 3 weeks had passed since my conversation with Marshall Hayes at the hospital. 3 weeks of intensive preparation, psychological evaluation, and the gradual construction of a new life that could withstand the scrutiny of federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and potentially hostile witnesses. The amnesia story had evolved into something more complex. Ethan Carter hadn't just witnessed suspicious activity on the mountain. He'd been Marcus Kellerman's captive for nearly 2 days before escaping during the raid on the Morrison Ranch. It was a dangerous lie, but it was the only way to explain how a teenage boy from Sacramento could know intimate details about a trafficking operation based in rural Oregon. The story positioned me as both victim and witness, someone who'd survived Marcus's initial kidnapping attempt and could testify to his methods and intentions. "How are you feeling?" asked Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the federal psychologist who'd been working with me to prepare for testimony. She was a small, intense woman with kind eyes and an obvious talent for helping traumatized people find their voices. "Terrified," I admitted. "What if they figure out who I really am? What if I slip up and say something that gives it away?" "Ethan, we've rehearsed your testimony dozens of times. You know this story inside and out. More importantly, everything you're going to say about Marcus's behavior and intentions is true, even if the circumstances of how you learned it are adjusted." The door opened, and Marshall Hayes entered, followed by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Thompson, the prosecutor who would be handling the case. Thompson was exactly what I'd expected from a federal prosecutor: sharp, professional, and radiating. The kind of confidence that comes from never losing an argument. "Are we ready?" Thompson asked, settling into a chair across from me. "The grand jury is convening in an hour, and I want to go over your testimony one more time." For the next 45 minutes, we rehearsed the story that would hopefully put the remaining members of Marcus's trafficking network behind bars. According to the official version, Ethan Carter had been hiking alone in the mountains when he'd been approached by Marcus and several associates. They'd claimed to be search and rescue workers looking for a missing girl, but their behavior had quickly turned threatening. I knew something was wrong when the big guy Marcus started asking me personal questions. I would testify. Where was I from? Did I have family looking for me? Was anyone expecting me back? It felt like he was evaluating me for something. The story continued with Marcus's group forcing me to accompany them to what they claimed was a search staging area, but which turned out to be an abandoned cabin deeper in the mountains. There, I'd overheard conversations about their real business: the systematic kidnapping and trafficking of young women from isolated communities. Marcus talked about girls like they were merchandise, I would tell the grand jury. He had photographs, profiles, information about their families and backgrounds. He knew which ones would be missed and which ones wouldn't. It was all true, even if I'd learned it through months of being stalked rather than 2 days of being held captive. Marcus really had evaluated potential victims based on their family situations and community connections. He really had kept detailed records of the girls he was targeting. And he really had spoken about human beings like they were objects to be bought and sold. "What about the escape?" Thompson asked. "Walk me through that again." I'd been tied up in the cabin for most of the second day when I heard helicopters and gunfire outside. Marcus and his men grabbed their weapons and ran out to see what was happening, leaving me alone for the first time. I managed to work free from the ropes and slipped out through a back window. And then you wandered in the mountains until the park ranger found you? Yes, I was dehydrated, disoriented from the head injury I'd sustained when they first grabbed me. I just kept walking until I collapsed on the trail. Thompson nodded, satisfied with the consistency of my story. The defense is going to try to poke holes in your timeline, especially the gap between when you escaped and when you were found. They'll suggest that you had time to fabricate details about conversations you claim to have overheard. What do I tell them? You tell them the truth, that trauma affects memory, that you're doing your best to recall events accurately, and that the details you remember are seared into your mind because they were so disturbing. After Thompson left to prepare for the grand jury session, I found myself alone with Hayes and Dr. Martinez. Through the window of the preparation room, I could see downtown Portland spread out below us, a bustling city where Emma Hartwell had once dreamed of attending college. It felt like looking at someone else's life, a future that had been stolen and could never be recovered. Marshall Hayes, I said quietly, what happens after today? Assuming the grand jury indicts and this goes to trial, what happens to Ethan? Carter? Full witness protection, he replied without hesitation. New identity, new location, federal protection, until the threat level diminishes. Which, in a case like this, could be years. And Rose? Your grandmother will be protected too, though her situation is more complex. She remains Rose Hartwell, the grieving grandmother of a missing girl, but will make sure she's monitored and relocated if necessary. The thought of Rose having to leave Millbrook, the town where she'd lived for 30 years, because of my decision to testify made my stomach churn. But the alternative, allowing Marcus's associates to continue trafficking girls, was unacceptable. There's something else, Dr. Martinez said, pulling out a file I hadn't seen before. Information that came to light during the investigation of Marcus's property and associates. Information you need to know before you testify. She opened the file and spread out a series of documents, financial records, travel receipts, correspondence between Marcus and people in other states. But it was the photographs that made my blood run cold. They were surveillance photos, taken with a telephoto lens, showing girls in various everyday situations. Walking to school, working at part-time jobs, shopping with friends. At least 20 different girls, all young, all matching the profile Hayes had described weeks earlier. These were found in Marcus's house, Martinez explained, hidden in a safe behind his bedroom wall. We believe they represent potential targets he was researching and evaluating. I forced myself to look at each photograph, hoping I wouldn't recognize any of the faces. But near the bottom of the stack, I found what I'd been dreading, a photo of myself, taken outside Henderson's hardware store just weeks before my escape. I was looking over my shoulder with an expression of obvious fear, clearly aware that I was being watched. He'd been planning this for a long time, I whispered. Months at least. The level of surveillance and preparation suggests this wasn't impulsive behavior. Marcus Kellerman was running a sophisticated operation. Dr. Martinez pulled out another document, a handwritten list in Marcus's own writing. It contained names, ages, family situations, and what appeared to be rankings or priority scores. My name was at the top of the list, marked with several asterisks and the notation, Phase 3, ready for acquisition. What does Phase 3 mean? Based on other documents, we found Phase 1 was initial identification and background research. Phase 2 was active surveillance and relationship mapping. Phase 3 was... She paused, choosing her words carefully, harvest preparation. The clinical terminology made it even more horrifying. Marcus hadn't just been a predator acting on impulse, he'd been running his trafficking operation like a business, with systems and procedures and performance metrics. How many girls made it to Phase 3? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. You were the first. which means you're the only person who can testify about what Phase 3 actually entailed from the victim's perspective. A knock on the door interrupted our conversation. "It's time," Thompson announced from the doorway. "The grand jury is ready for your testimony." As I stood up and straightened my tie, Ethan Carter wore suits now, another part of the transformation. I thought about all the girls in those photographs. 20 young women who had no idea they were being hunted, who were going about their daily lives while a monster planned their destruction. The grand jury room was smaller than I'd expected, with 23 ordinary citizens sitting in a semicircle, their faces expressing various degrees of interest, skepticism, and concern. They ranged in age from early 20s to late 60s, representing a cross-section of Portland society that would hopefully understand the gravity of what I was about to tell them. "State your name for the record," Thompson instructed. "Ethan Michael Carter." "And how old are you, Mr. Carter?" 18. "Can you tell the grand jury why you're here today?" I took a deep breath and began the most important performance of my life. For the next 2 hours, I told them about Marcus Kellerman's trafficking operation from the perspective of someone who'd experienced it firsthand. I described the systematic stalking, the careful evaluation of potential victims, the sophisticated network of associates who helped identify and transport girls across state lines. The grand jurors listened with expressions of growing horror as I detailed Marcus's methods, how he would research his targets for months before making contact, how he used his family's business connections to identify vulnerable girls in small towns across the Pacific Northwest, how he would isolate his victims socially and economically before moving to the acquisition phase. "Did you ever see any of the other victims Mr. Kellerman discussed?" one grand juror asked. "No, but I heard him and his associates talking about previous successes. They referred to girls by numbers rather than names. Number 7 was sold to buyers in Nevada. Number 12 was transported to a facility in Texas. They talked about them like they were discussing livestock." "Did you witness any financial transactions related to this operation?" I saw Marcus receive a phone call where he discussed prices. He quoted $15,000 for what he called premium merchandise, young, attractive girls from stable backgrounds who wouldn't be immediately missed. It was all true, even if I'd learned it through months of being stalked rather than days of being held captive. Marcus really had discussed prices with potential buyers. He really had referred to his victims by numbers rather than names. And he really had specialized in girls who wouldn't generate immediate, intensive search efforts. The most difficult part of my testimony came when Thompson asked me to describe my escape and the raid on the Morrison Ranch. I had to be careful to position myself as a witness to the violence rather than a participant, someone who'd seen the gunfight from hiding rather than someone who'd been in the house when it happened. "I heard the helicopters first," I testified. "Then gunfire." Marcus and his men grabbed their weapons and ran outside, leaving me tied up in the cabin. I managed to work free and escape through a back window. From the tree line, I could see the ranch house in the distance, could see the police helicopters and officers moving around. I knew it was my chance to get away. "And how long did you wander in the mountains before you were found?" "I'm not sure." "Exactly. Time becomes fluid when you're injured and scared. It felt like forever, but it might have been only a few hours. I just kept walking until I collapsed on the trail where the park ranger found me." When my testimony was complete, Thompson dismissed me with a nod of professional satisfaction. The grand jurors had asked good questions, probing questions, but none that had shaken my story or revealed inconsistencies. As I left the courthouse, I felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. Ethan Carter had just become real in the eyes of the federal justice system. But more importantly, Emma Hartwell's story had finally been told. Even if no one would ever know it was her story. Hayes was waiting for me outside the courthouse, standing beside a black SUV with tinted windows. "How did it go?" "I think they believed me," Thompson seemed satisfied with my answers. Good, because we just received word that the grand jury has voted to indict all 5 surviving members of Marcus's organization. This is going to trial, which means you're going to be the star witness in a very high-profile federal case. As we drove through Portland's afternoon traffic, I watched the city where Emma Hartwell had once planned to attend college, Portland. State University's campus passed by the window, and I felt a pang of loss for the future that had been stolen from me. But I also felt something else, a sense of purpose that Emma Hartwell had never possessed. Ethan Carter was going to make sure that Marcus Kellerman's victims received justice. And in doing so, he was going to honor the memory of a girl named Emma who had been brave enough to disappear in order to survive. The new life was just beginning. The safe house in Spokane, Washington looked like every other suburban ranch home. On Maple Grove Avenue, beige siding, manicured lawn, 2-car garage, and the kind of anonymous perfection that screamed, "Nothing interesting happens here." Which was exactly the point. For the past 6 months, it had been home to Ethan Carter, federal witness, while prosecutors prepared for the trial that would determine whether Marcus Kellerman's trafficking network would be dismantled or allowed to reconstitute under new leadership. I stood at the kitchen window, watching Deputy U.S. Marshal Cristina Valdez tend to the small vegetable garden she'd planted in the backyard. Valdez was my primary protection detail, a compact woman in her 30s with the kind of situational awareness that made me feel safe for the first time in over a year. She'd been assigned to my case specifically because of her experience protecting witnesses in organized crime prosecutions. "The tomatoes are coming along nicely," she said as she came back inside, brushing dirt from her hands. "Should have fresh salsa by next week." It was a strange kind of normalcy, this life in witness protection. I attended community college classes under the name Ethan Carter, studying criminal justice with the goal of eventually joining law enforcement myself. I worked part-time at a local bookstore, lived in a house provided by the federal government, and maintained the fiction that I was a young man recovering from trauma while pursuing his education. But underneath the peaceful suburban routine, I was constantly preparing for the trial that would define the rest of my life. Every morning brought new briefings from prosecutors, new evidence to review, new details to memorize about my cover story. The case against Marcus's associates had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. "We need to talk, Valdez," sighed, her tone suddenly serious. "Thompson just called. There's been a development." I set down the coffee mug I'd been holding and followed her into the living room, where she activated a secure communication device that looked like an ordinary tablet, but was actually connected to an encrypted federal network. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Thompson appeared on the screen, her expression grim. Behind her, I could see the familiar chaos of a prosecutor's office in the final stages of trial preparation. "Ethan, we've got a problem," Thompson said without preamble. One of the defendants just flipped. Vincent Torres, Marcus's cousin who handled the financial side of the operation. He's offering to testify against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence. I felt a chill run down my spine. What does that mean for my testimony? It means Torres is going to provide details about the trafficking operation that could contradict elements of your story. He knows things about Marcus's methods and timeline that might not align with what you've told us. Valdez leaned forward. How significant are the potential contradictions? Significant enough that the defense will try to use them to discredit Ethan's entire testimony. Torres claims that Marcus never held victims at remote locations for extended periods. According to him, the operation was much more efficient. Girls were identified, acquired, and transported within 24 hours. My stomach dropped. The story we'd constructed, that I'd been held captive for 2 days at an isolated cabin, was about to be contradicted by someone with intimate knowledge of Marcus's actual procedures. "Can we adjust my testimony?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Not without raising questions about why your memory of events has changed so dramatically between the grand jury testimony and the trial. Thompson replied, "The defense would have a field day with that kind of inconsistency." Valdez was studying the information on her own screen, her face increasingly troubled. What about the physical evidence? The cabin where Ethan was supposedly held. That's another problem. Torres provided locations for all of Marcus's operational sites. There's no cabin matching Ethan's description anywhere in the area where he claims to have been held. The careful construction of my cover story was falling apart in real time, and I could see the implications spreading like cracks in ice. If my testimony was discredited, the entire case against Marcus's network could collapse. Worse, if investigators started digging into the inconsistencies, they might uncover the truth about Emma Hartwell's death and the network of people who'd helped her disappear. There has to be something we can do, I said. Some way to salvage this. Thompson was quiet for a moment, and I could practically see her calculating options and probabilities. There is one possibility, but it's risky. Instead of positioning you as a kidnapping victim, we could present you as an informant who infiltrated Marcus's operation. An informant? Someone who deliberately got close to Marcus in order to gather intelligence about his activities. It would explain your detailed knowledge of the trafficking operation without requiring the cabin story. Valdez frowned. That would make Ethan a target for retaliation from every criminal organization in the region. Informants don't usually live long after their cover is blown in open court, which is why he'd need permanent relocation and a completely new identity after the trial. No more Ethan Carter, no more connections to his previous life. The weight of what Thompson was suggesting settled over me like a heavy blanket. Complete erasure, not just of Emma Hartwell, who was already officially dead, but of Ethan Carter. 2. I would become a third person with a third identity, cutting all ties to everyone I'd ever known, including Rose. What about my grandmother? I asked quietly. Thompson's expression softened slightly. She'd be relocated as well, given a new identity for her protection, but you couldn't have any contact with her ever. As far as the world would know, both Emma Hartwell and Rose Hartwell died. Emma in a hiking accident, Rose from complications related to her heart condition. You're asking me to let her die twice, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm asking you to help us prevent other girls from dying at all. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sound of children playing in a neighbor's yard. Normal kids, living normal lives, unaware that monsters like Marcus Kellerman existed in the world. How long do I have to decide? 24 hours. If we're going to change her testimony, we need to start preparing immediately. The trial begins in 3 weeks. After Thompson signed off, I sat in the living room staring at the wall where Ethan Carter's community college diploma would eventually hang. It was a modest achievement, but it represented something I'd never had as Emma Hartwell, the freedom to choose my own future. Now that future was about to be stripped away again, replaced by yet another fabricated identity. What are you thinking? Valdez asked, settling into the chair across from me. I'm thinking about all the girls in those photographs Marcus kept. 20 faces, 20 lives that were marked for destruction. If I don't testify, if I don't make this work somehow, those girls are still out there, still being hunted by whatever's left of his network. And if you do testify, you spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering if today's the day someone figures out who you really are. I thought about Rose, lying in that hospital bed, sacrificing her health and her peace of mind to give me a chance at freedom. I thought about Jim and Margaret Morrison, risking their lives to protect a stranger. I thought about all the people who'd helped me disappear, who'd invested in the fiction that Emma Hartwell was dead so that someone better could live. There's something else, I said, an idea beginning to form. What if we don't just change my testimony? What if we change the entire approach? Valdez raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? What if Ethan Carter disappears before the trial? What if he has a breakdown, or an accident, or just vanishes? What if instead of testifying, I provide evidence through other means? You're talking about staging another death. I'm talking about completing the transformation. Emma Hartwell died so Ethan Carter could live. Now Ethan Carter dies so someone else can finish what we started. It was a radical idea, but as I explained it to Valdez, I could see her professional interest being piqued. Instead of putting a compromised witness on the stand, the prosecution could present Ethan Carter as a hero who died protecting his information. His testimony could be introduced as a dying declaration, his evidence preserved in video depositions that couldn't be cross-examined or discredited. It would require extensive staging, Valdez said slowly. Death certificates, witness statements, physical evidence of an accident or attack. But it would protect everyone involved, and it would still give the prosecution what they need to. Convict Marcus's associates. What about you? Where would you go? Who would you become? I thought about that question for a long time. Emma Hartwell had been a frightened girl with limited options. Ethan Carter had been a federal witness with a predetermined role to play. But this third person, whoever she or he might be, could be anything. I don't know yet, I admitted. But for the first time since this all started, that feels like freedom rather than uncertainty. Over the next several hours, we worked out the details of what would become known as the Ethan Carter solution. It was complex, requiring coordination between multiple federal agencies and the kind of creative thinking that wasn't usually associated with government bureaucracy. But as word of the plan spread through the prosecution team, it gained momentum. The key insight was that Ethan Carter's death would actually strengthen the case rather than weakening it. Dead witnesses couldn't be impeached by defense attorneys. Dead witnesses couldn't have their stories picked apart on cross-examination. And dead witnesses, especially young ones who died trying to expose criminal networks, generated the kind of sympathy among jurors that could override technical legal objections. We'd need to make it look like retaliation, Thompson explained during the secure conference call later that evening. Someone from Marcus's network seeking revenge for his death and the grand jury indictments. What about the Morrison Ranch? I asked. If investigators start looking into Ethan Carter's background, they might discover connections to the network that helped Emma disappear. That's why the attack on Ethan can't be random. It has to be specifically targeted, the kind of precision strike that suggests inside knowledge. We'll position it as evidence that Marcus's associates have infiltrated law enforcement or the witness protection program. The beauty of the plan was its recursive nature, every element that might expose. The fiction actually reinforced it instead. The more investigators looked into Ethan Carter's death, the more evidence they'd find of a sophisticated criminal network capable of reaching protected witnesses. It would validate everything the prosecution had been saying about Marcus's organization, while making it impossible to trace the real origins of the case. When would this happen? Valdez asked. Soon, within the week. We need Ethan's death to occur before Torres's testimony becomes public, before the defense has a chance to raise questions about inconsistencies. As the call ended and plans began to solidify around me, I felt a strange sense of peace. Emma Hartwell had died in fear, running from a monster who wanted to possess her. Ethan Carter would die as a hero, someone who'd given his life to protect other people from the same fate. And somewhere, somehow, a third person would emerge from the ashes of both those identities, someone who could live freely, without fear, carrying the memories of everyone who'd sacrificed to make that freedom possible. The next morning, I wrote a letter to Rose, not as Ethan Carter, federal witness, but as the granddaughter who loved her more than words could express. I told her about the choice I was making, about why it was necessary, and about my hope that someday, years from now, when all the danger had passed, we might find a way to be family again. But I never sent the letter. Some sacrifices were too complete, too final, for goodbye notes. Instead, I folded it carefully and placed it in the bottom of a jewelry box that had belonged to Emma Hartwell, a keepsake that would travel with me into whatever life came next. On Thursday morning, Ethan Carter would die in what appeared to be a carefully planned assassination. By Thursday afternoon, a different person entirely would be boarding a plane to a city chosen at random, carrying nothing but cash and the skills necessary to build a completely new existence. The transformation would finally be complete. 5 years later, I stood in the office of the Seattle Center for Missing and Exploited Children, looking out at Elliott Bay while storm clouds gathered over Puget Sound. The nameplate on my desk read, Alex Morgan, Director of Victim Services, but the person behind that name bore little resemblance to either Emma Hartwell or Ethan Carter. 3 identities, 3 lives, 3 chances to become something better than what circumstances had originally allowed. The transformation had been completed exactly as planned. On March 15th, Ethan Carter had died in what appeared to be a targeted assassination outside a Spokane grocery store. The attack was swift, professional, and left no witnesses because there had been no attack at all. Marshall Valdez had orchestrated the entire scene with the precision of a theater director, complete with blood packs, emergency responders who were actually federal agents, and security footage that showed exactly what investigators needed to see. Within hours, every news outlet in the Pacific Northwest was running stories about the brave young man who'd given his life to expose a human trafficking network. Ethan Carter became a symbol, a martyr whose courage had saved countless lives. The prosecution used his video testimony and documentary evidence to secure convictions against all 5 of Marcus's associates, with sentences ranging from 25 years to life without parole. But the person who'd actually lived through those events had disappeared completely, emerging 6 months later as Alex Morgan, a recent graduate of the University of Washington's social work program, specializing in trauma counseling for trafficking victims. The federal government had provided an impeccable backstory, complete with academic transcripts, employment history, and references from professors who'd been briefed on the importance of maintaining the fiction. Alex, my assistant's voice came through the intercom. The Johnson family is here for their appointment. I straightened my tie. Alex Morgan wore professional attire, gender-neutral clothing that allowed me to navigate the world without the constant performance that had defined my previous identities. After years of pretending to be first a boy, then a young man, I'd finally found a way to simply be myself without explanation or justification. Send them in, please. The Johnsons were typical of the families I worked with, middle-class parents whose teenage daughter had vanished from a shopping mall in Tacoma 3 months earlier. The police had initially treated it as a runaway case, but the family had insisted something more sinister had happened. They'd been right. "Ms. Morgan," said Rebecca Johnson, clutching her husband's hand like a lifeline, "the detective said you might be able to help us understand what Sarah went through." I'd been having these conversations for 3 years now, helping families navigate the aftermath of trafficking cases. It was delicate work, requiring me to explain the psychological and physical trauma their loved ones had endured without destroying hope for recovery. But it was also the most meaningful work I'd ever done, using my experience to help other people heal. "Sarah's case is similar to others we've seen," I explained, pulling out a file that contained updates from the FBI task force that had rescued their daughter. The traffickers used sophisticated psychological manipulation to control her, but the important thing is that she survived. With proper support and counseling, victims can and do recover from these experiences. What I couldn't tell them was that I knew exactly what Sarah had endured because I'd lived through a variation of it myself. Marcus's network had been dismantled, but others had taken its place, using similar methods to identify and acquire vulnerable young people. The work continued, but now I was on the other side of it, helping survivors instead of being one. After the Johnsons left, I returned to my office and opened the secure email account that connected me to a very different kind of network than the one that had once saved my life. This was a legitimate organization, funded by federal grants and private donations, but it operated on some of the same principles that had enabled my own disappearance: careful compartmentalization of information, trusted contacts in law enforcement, and an understanding that sometimes the official system couldn't protect everyone who needed protection. The email that was waiting for me made my catch. Alex, new case, urgent. 16-year-old girl in Wenatchee, WA. Local businessmen making threats, family intimidated, police compromised. Girl's name is Maria Santos. Sound familiar? Contact me ASAP. JMJM was Jim Morrison, though he now operated under a different identity as well. The Morrison Ranch had been disbanded after Ethan Carter's death, but Jim and Margaret had continued their work through other channels. They'd become my informal partners in cases that required the kind of creative solutions that government agencies couldn't officially provide. Maria Santos. The name did sound familiar, and when I checked my database of potential trafficking targets, I found her file immediately. She'd been flagged by social workers 6 months earlier as fitting the profile of girls who typically attracted traffickers: isolated family situation, limited local support network, above average physical attractiveness. Someone had been watching her, studying her, preparing for acquisition. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Jim's number. Morrison Consulting, he answered in the gravelly voice that had once offered me salvation in a truck stop diner. It's Alex. I got your message about Maria Santos. Figured you might remember her. The businessman making threats is Walter Kruger, owns half the town, including the sheriff's mortgage. Classic pattern, right down to the forced isolation and escalating intimidation. My blood ran cold. How long do we have? Not long. Our contact in the family says Kruger's been talking about a June wedding, just like Marcus did with me. I finished the sentence, my mind already racing through possibilities. What are options? The family's willing to consider a disappearance scenario, but they're scared. They need someone who understands what they're going through, someone who can explain how this works and why it's necessary. I looked out at the storm clouds gathering over Seattle and made a decision that would have been impossible for either Emma Hartwell or Ethan Carter. But Alex Morgan had resources they'd never possessed: professional credentials, federal connections, and most importantly, the knowledge that came from having walked this path before. I'll leave tonight. Can you arrange a meeting? Already done. Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, at the address I'm texting you now. As I prepared to leave Seattle, I thought about the circular nature of what I was about to do. 5 years ago, I'd been the terrified girl who needed saving. Now I was the person with the power to save someone else. The transformation wasn't just about changing identities, it was about changing from victim to survivor to advocate. The drive to Wenatchee took me through mountain passes that reminded me of that night when Jim Morrison had taken me to safety. But this time, I was driving my own car, making my own choices, using skills I'd developed rather than depending on others for rescue. Maria Santos lived with her aunt in a small house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by apple orchards that stretched toward the Cascade foothills. When I knocked on the door, the woman who answered looked exactly like Rose had during those final days in Millbrook: exhausted, frightened, but determined to protect someone she loved. "You must be Alex," said Carmen Santos, Maria's aunt. "Jim. Morrison said you might be able to help us." Inside, I met Maria, a slight, dark-haired girl who reminded me painfully of my younger self. She had the same haunted look I'd seen in my own mirror during those final weeks before my escape, the expression of someone who knew she was being hunted, but didn't know how to fight back. "Maria," I said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, "I want you to know that what you're going through isn't your fault, and it's not hopeless. There are people who can help you disappear safely, Completely, if that's what you choose. But I'd have to leave everything behind, she said. Quietly, my family, my school, my entire life. Yes, but you'd have a chance to build a new life, one where Walter Kruger can never touch you. Over the next 3 hours, I explained the process, the careful preparation, the staged disappearance, the months of building a new identity in a safe location. I told her about the network of people who made such things possible, about the resources available to help her not just survive but thrive. What I didn't tell her was my own story. That would have violated every protocol about operational security and compartmentalized information. But I could see in her eyes the same calculation I'd once made, the weighing of certain destruction against uncertain hope. If I do this, Maria said finally, could I help other people someday? Could I use what I learned to save someone else? The question took me back to that moment in the Portland courthouse when I decided to testify, knowing it would cost me everything but might prevent other girls from suffering. Maria was already thinking beyond her own survival, already considering how her experience might serve a larger purpose. Yes, I said simply, that's exactly what you could do. 6 months later, Maria Santos died in a car accident on a mountain highway outside Wenatchee. The local newspaper ran a small obituary noting her academic achievements and the tragedy of a young life cut short. Walter Kruger attended the funeral, playing the role of a concerned community leader mourning the loss of a promising young woman. But somewhere in Minnesota, a girl named Rachel Porter was beginning her freshman year at a small liberal arts college, studying social work and criminology with the goal of eventually joining the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. She sent me updates occasionally through encrypted channels, reports on her progress and her growing understanding of the work that lay ahead. As I write this, the network that once saved my life continues to operate, helping people disappear when the official system fails them. We've evolved, become more sophisticated, more connected to legitimate law enforcement efforts. But the core mission remains the same, ensuring that no one has to face monsters like Marcus Kellerman or Walter Kruger alone. Emma Hartwell died in those Oregon mountains so that others could live. Ethan Carter sacrificed his life so that justice could be served. And Alex Morgan continues their work, using the freedom they bought with their deaths to build something better than mere survival. Sometimes, the only way to truly live is to die. First, sometimes the only way to save yourself is to become someone else entirely. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that transformation creates not just safety, but purpose, the chance to ensure that other people never have to make the same terrible choice between submission and disappearance. The war against predators like Marcus Kellerman continues. But now, instead of being their victim, I'm their worst nightmare, someone who escaped, someone who survived, someone who learned to fight back. They made me dress like a boy to escape. But what emerged from that deception was something neither male nor female, neither victim nor survivor, but something new entirely. Something dangerous to those who would hurt the innocent. Something free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.